to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Bonn, Germany. Zimbabwe's military says it's deposed President Robert Mugabe and First Lady Grace Mugabe and has appointed recently ousted Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa as interim president. This comes just 1 week after Mugabe ousted the vice president, who's a close ally of Zimbabwe's army chief. Witnesses reported seeing armored personnel carriers in the streets with heavy gun and artillery fire in parts of the capital, Harare. Zimbabwe's military denied it had carried out a coup. A military spokesman said on state television the action was taken to target criminals surrounding the 93-year-old seven-term leader. In the United States, Senate Republicans have added a repeal of the Affordable Care Act's individual health insurance mandate to their plan to overhaul the U.S. tax code. The plan would end a requirement that most Americans obtain health insurance or face a tax penalty, a linchpin in keeping President Obama's signature health care law from collapsing. Meanwhile, the Congressional Budget Office warned Tuesday the House Republicans' tax bill would trigger $25 billion in cuts to Medicare next year. Both the House and Senate plans would shower billions of dollars in tax cuts on the wealthiest Americans. Attorney General Jeff Sessions testified Tuesday. He only recently recalled speaking with former Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos, who's admitted having had contacts with Russians during the Trump campaign. Sessions is accused of committing perjury for previously telling Congress he was not aware of any Trump campaign official talking to the Russians, when in fact he led a meeting in March 2016 during which Papadopoulos talked about his ties to Russia and suggested setting up a meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. On Tuesday, Sessions testified he now remembers rejecting Papadopoulos' idea at that meeting and telling Papadopoulos he did not have the authority to represent the Trump campaign in such discussions. This is Sessions speaking to the House Judiciary Committee.
Frankly, I had no recollection of this meeting until I saw these news reports. I do now recall that the March 2016 meeting at the Trump Hotel that Mr. Papadopoulos attended, but I have no clear recollection of the details of what he said at that meeting.
Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, Pentagon leaders told the Senate panel Tuesday they would ignore any unlawful order by the president to launch a nuclear strike. The testimony came as part of the first congressional hearings in more than 40 years on the president's authority to start a nuclear war. This is Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy.
We are concerned that the President of the United States is so unstable, is so volatile, has a decision-making process that is so quixotic that he might order a nuclear weapons strike that is wildly out of step with U.S. national security interests.
An eighth woman has come forward to accuse former President George H.W. Bush of groping her. In a Democracy Now! Exclusive, a former flight attendant told us that in the early 90s, soon after Bush's presidential term ended, she was working in first class when the former president, quote, grabbed my arm, complimenting me on my tan and how pretty I looked, and would not let go of my arm and pulled me close to his seat and put his arm around below my waist, the butt area. He was sitting, I was standing, trying to work. I couldn't get away. The captain was not happy. The president didn't let go until the captain announced we missed our takeoff spot. The captain was looking at me with the door open. That's how he knew I wasn't seated for takeoff, because the president wouldn't let go of my arm, and they can't take off until we're all seated, unquote. Those the words of a former flight attendant. Now another woman to come forward to accuse former President George H.W. Bush of groping her. She says Bush was sitting next to his wife, Barbara, in the plane. This comes after Broadway actress Megan Elizabeth Lewis said Tuesday George H.W. Bush grabbed her buttocks after he asked her to take a photo with him in 2009 at one of her performances in Houston. In California, a gunman with a semi-automatic rifle and 2 handguns went on a deadly rampage in the rural town of Rancho Tehama. Tuesday, killing 4 people and injuring at least 10 others before he was shot and killed by police. The shooter was identified as a 43-year-old white man named Kevin Jansen Neal. He was being prosecuted on charges of assault with a deadly weapon for stabbing 2 of his neighbors, a man and a woman, both of whom were killed at the start of Tuesday's rampage. Among the wounded were 2 children, including a student hit when the shooter fired on an elementary school. The mass shooting came on the same day Connecticut Supreme Court heard arguments in a case brought by families of the victims of the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre. Their lawsuit targets the Remington Outdoor Company, which produced the AR-15 Bushmaster rifle used to slaughter 20 children and 6 adults. Lawyer Joshua Koskoff told the court Remington's marketing campaign was designed to appeal to young men like the killer Adam Lanza.
They had a plan, a clear plan, we know this from the public, what's publicly available, to expand and control the civilian market for assault rifles. And their approach, and we allege this in our complaint, is to attract buyers by extolling the militaristic and assaultive qualities of their AR-15s. We have evidence that Adam Lanza heard the message and was driven specifically to the Bushmaster for his lone gunman combat mission.
The state of Ohio is set to put a severely ill prisoner to death today after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to halt his planned execution. Officials at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville say they'll provide a wedge-shaped pillow to 69-year-old Alva Campbell to help him breathe while they strap him to a gurney and inject him with a lethal 3-drug cocktail. Campbell relies on a walker and wears a colostomy bag. His lawyers say he requires frequent breathing treatments and may have lung cancer. During a recent exam, a doctor failed to find veins in either of Campbell's arms suitable for inserting an IV. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition bombed the main airport in the capital Sana'a on Tuesday, damaging the runway and destroying navigation equipment. The attack came after Saudi Arabia shut air, land, and sea routes into Yemen, drawing warnings from the United Nations that the clampdown could worsen Yemen's massive cholera epidemic and set off the largest famine the world has seen in decades, with millions of victims. Tuesday's attack drew condemnation from Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who tweeted, quote, "The U.S.-Saudi coalition took out the Sana'a airport last night. Now, no humanitarian relief by air. This is barbaric," Murphy tweeted. In Libya, human rights monitors who toured the country's migrant detention camps say nearly 20,000 people are enduring horrific conditions. This is United Nations spokesperson Jeremy Lawrence.
Monitors were shocked by what they witnessed. Thousands of emaciated and traumatised men, women and children piled on top of one another, locked up in hangars with no access to the most basic necessities and stripped of their human dignity.
Human rights advocates want the European Union to withdraw its support for Libya's prime minister and the allied militias who run migrant detention centers. As part of a clampdown on sea crossings, the European Union currently supplies funds, equipment, and training for Libya's border and Coast Guard. And Australians have decisively voted in favour of marriage equality, prompting Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to call on Parliament to pass a bill legalising all marriages countrywide by the end of the year. Nearly 80% of Australians voted in the non-binding National Postal Survey, with nearly 2/3 approving of marriage equality. The outcome sparked celebrations in cities across Australia. This is Sydney City Councillor Christine Forster.
Yeah, it's been a really special moment. It's a seminal moment, I think, for Australia. It's the point in our history where we have said we vote resoundingly for a better, fairer, more equal country, and that is so special. You can't put a price on that. Yeah.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.